In week 10 we look at trusts and estates. The idea of a trust and the idea of an estate are really different topics, and although there is some connection between the two, we are simply doing two topics in 1 week. The introduction on Interact is quite comprehensive, and so this screencast can be as brief as possible, but the following should be said, and let's deal with trusts first. Everybody knows about contracts. Even if we don't know the legal intricacies of how contract law works, most people, perhaps with the exception of children, have a general idea that it is an agreement, often in writing but not necessarily, and that they can be enforced by courts. The contractual relationship is a kind of relationship that is ubiquitous. In other words, it's everywhere. Trusts are a bit like dark matter. They too are ubiquitous, but the level of understanding that the average person on the street has about trusts is probably nothing or close to nothing. Yet they are everywhere in our society. Perhaps not as much as contracts, but still they are by no means reserved for exotic transactions. What is a trust? A trust is simply a legal relationship, just like a contract, between one person and another, but in relation to some property. The trustee is the person who owns the property and controls the property, but the law requires them to use the property for the benefit of someone else. So you can see a trust is a relationship, and obviously the most important aspect of trust law must be, what are the trustee's duties? What must they do and not do in order to ensure they have discharged their duties towards the beneficiaries properly? In a way, you can compare the trust scenario to many other kinds of situations. Politicians wield executive power and are also supposed to exercise it for the benefit of citizens, not for their own benefit. Directors of companies hold the power to control a company and spend its money, but they must do this for the benefit of shareholders, not for their own benefit. So you can see this kind of relationship is not uncommon. The real legal trust has a long and peculiar history, and its existence is owed almost entirely on the English legal system, since it is a creature of the Court of Equity there. No other legal system has anything quite like the trust. Many think of trusts as an entity, rather like a company. It's even referred to often as an entity. The tax office has sometimes referred to it as an entity, and other institutions, and frequently in discussions between professionals it is referred to as an entity. But it simply is not an entity. A trust is a relationship between one person who legally owns property, but only owns that property for the benefit of another, and they are legally obliged to deal with the property in a way that benefits the other person. So they can't take the property for themselves, and all sorts of other obligations arise in respect of the trust. As it happens, this peculiar relationship has had many financial benefits, including tax benefits. It also has benefits in terms of protecting property and enforcing the obligation to take care of property, since a breach of trust is treated very seriously with very harsh consequences. Enough said for trusts for now. What about estates? The word estate is a term that vaguely refers to all of a person's financial worth at any given time. If you say, what is someone's estate worth, or what does it consist of, you're looking at the total value of their assets and their liabilities. And although the word estate refers to all these assets and liabilities at any given time, when people refer to estates law, they are generally referring to the law of what happens to a person's estate when they die. Who takes control of the property, and where does their property go? In general, there are two broad procedures. A procedure for what happens when someone dies when they have a will, and a procedure for what happens when someone dies when they do not have a will, in which case we say the person died intestate. The person who takes control of the assets and deals with them according to the will and or the law is called the personal representative. When there is a will, the personal representative has an even more specific title. They are the executor or executrix. If there is no will, they are called the administrator. If the person who died had a will, The will would indicate who is to take control of the assets. In other words, it's indicating who is the personal representative and to affect the wishes of the deceased, who we call the testator. This person is called the executor, as I mentioned, and is very similar to a trustee. They have to approach the court and prove the will. In other words, they have to show that it really is the will of the deceased. If the court is satisfied, the court makes a grant of probate. In other words, the person becomes the executor and takes control of the property to be dealt with according to the will. If there is no will, someone may apply to become the administrator, which is the intestate equivalent of the executor. The administrator, rather than applying for probate, applies for what's called letters of administration, which is simply a document expressing the court's approval that they can be the administrator. And it is after this process is complete that the personal representative, that is, the executor or the administrator, takes control of the assets and administers them according to the will or according to the law.